While God has been silent throughout 37 chapters, now we hear from Job's creator, indeed, the creator of all that is. God poses questions that humble us with a description of the awesomeness of creation. God sees creation beyond regions hospitable to us and without us at the center. Creation is unpredictable and sometimes violent. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Get ready, brace yourself. I will question you, and you shall declare to me, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? With the morning stars sang together, and all the heavenly beings shouted for joy. Or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst out from the womb? When I made the clouds its garment, and thick darkness its swaddling band, and prescribed bounds for it, and set bars and doors, and said, thus far shall you come and no farther, and here shall your proud waves be stopped. Who has cut a channel for the torrents of rain, and a way for the thunderbolt, to bring rain on a land where no one lives, on the desert which is empty of human life, to satisfy the waste and desolate land, and to make the ground put forth grass. Holy wisdom, holy word.
Thanks be to God.
The good news according to John, the 6th chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
The God of creation came into creation as a creature to show us God's compassion. Jesus shows his power over creation. When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, got into a boat, and started across the lake to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The lake became rough because of a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the lake and coming near the boat, and they were terrified. But he said to them, it is I, do not be afraid. The gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ.
Christ. So this is our 4th week. We have one more week of our series on Job. And for me, I just can't get away from the beginning of Job, where God is just having this casual conversation with Satan, where God is the one who brings Satan's attention to Job and says, have you considered Job? Isn't he like just the most fantastic guy that I've ever made? And Satan, starts to challenge God, say, oh, you are boasting about this Job? You think he's so wonderful? Why don't we test him? So we've gone over this in my mind, and when we've talked about this on Sundays, who is this God who tests people in this casual way? And we just can't get away from this idea of who is this and why is this happening? It kind of reminds me of a movie, Trading Places, with Dan Aykroyd and Eddie Murphy, where these 2 men are deciding that they're going to find out by an experiment whether a person's life is determined more by their environment or by their genetics. And so they take someone who's doing very well working for them and as a commodities trader, and someone else who's homeless on the street, and trade them between each other to find out, could somebody whose life has been, taken all the wrong turns and has left them on the street, could that person simply be put in better circumstances? Or is there something about them as a person that would determine them to be there? So, it's kind of a horrible thing to do to 2 people, to play with their lives like that. And it's kind of the way God and Satan are just like chatting with each other. It's like they're golfing buddies or something. And they're just talking about, hey, what do you think about Job? And what do you make of him? And what does he tell us about people and about how people respond and why people respond the way they do? God is talking about how wonderful Job is. And Satan says, well, look at him. He's wealthy. He's got, family. He's got livestock. He's got more than anybody else. Why wouldn't he love God? why wouldn't he be a good person who praises God? And take all that stuff away from him and then see what happens. So as we think about who is this God and who is this Satan, it's important to realize that different books of the Bible are not describing kind of the same theology. We come to that today towards the end of Job's book because there's this whole story of creation. And you might stop and say, didn't we hear about creation in Genesis? And what is this creation? And why does this creation sound different? Because it does sound very different from the creation in Genesis. So you've got a God who we don't quite recognize because of the way he's speaking, the way in which he's treating Job. And you've got a creation that's a whole nother creation that doesn't quite line up with the creation that we heard in Genesis. So what we learn from this is that there's a creation story in first Genesis, and then the second chapter of Genesis has another creation story. Job has another creation story. There's creation stories in the Psalms. When we get to John's gospel, John has another creation story. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. That's another whole creation story. So a way I want to maybe help people to think about this is by the example of Star Trek. So that's an example that works for me, just like Trading Places is from the 1980s. I don't know who else that works for. But Star Trek was a TV series that was created in the 1960s, and it had this cast of characters that everybody knows: Captain Kirk, Mr. Spock, Mr. Sulu, Lieutenant Uhura, Dr. McCoy. Everybody knows those characters. So about 5 years ago, J.J. Abrams said, I'm going to make a Star Trek movie. And what other people have done is they've gone on to new spaceships and new casts and new crews. But J.J. Abrams said, I'm going to take that same crew and I'm going to make a movie about them. But what he did was he changed their stories. He changed their character in a little bit, in some ways. Using that same stock group of people, the same crew on the same ship, he changed their stories. So he said, rather than people wondering why these different actors, because he's not going to use the actors from 50 years ago, he says, I'm going to have new actors and they're going to have new storylines. So that Mr. Spock and Lieutenant Uhura have a love affair, which never happened in the TV series. And Captain Kirk, we get a whole origin story for him about how his birthday, the day of his birth came about, which gives us a whole origin story about Captain Kirk that did not line up with anything from the TV show. So that in J.J. Abrams' movie, Captain Kirk loses his father on the day he's born. His father dies in this blaze of glory, sacrificing himself to save hundreds of lives. That didn't happen to Captain Kirk from the TV show. So J.J. Abrams said, like other people have done when they've tried to recreate a new version of something, that there's a multiverse. And that there's a Captain Kirk in the Gene Roddenberry universe, and there's another Captain Kirk in another universe, which is the J.J. Abrams universe, and others. So that the same people will make different decisions and different universes will go different ways. So that works for J.J. Abrams to tell his story without having to line up everything with the 1960s TV show, barring those characters and saying, in a multiverse, this is another universe with those characters who happen to be the same crew on the same ship, but so much is different about them. And Captain Kirk's origin story about his father dying makes him a grittier, edgier kind of a person, because that's the kind of movie that J.J. Abrams wants. He wants something that, that's a little bit more sexually explicit. It's a little more dark. It's a little more uncertain. It doesn't all get wrapped up in a half an hour with a happy story. So the multiverse is a way in which people can tell the same story with the same characters and say, but what you know about them before, this is something different. But because this is a universe where they made a different decision and their life went in a different direction. So I think that's helpful in looking at the Bible to say there are different universes in the Bible. There's the universe of Genesis 1 with its creation story. There's the universe of Genesis 2. There's the universe of Job. We tend to conflate those as if it's all one universe, all one story. So that we think that Satan in Job's book is the same as the serpent in Genesis. And it's the same as whatever evil characters appear in other books, such as the book of Revelation. But they're actually different universes, where they're actually talking about a different theology, a different way of speaking about God, and a different way of understanding God. The God of Genesis chapter 1 is not the same as the God of Genesis chapter 2. And those creation stories don't line up with each other. So Job today gives us this creation story in which it's so different from Genesis 1. Genesis 1, God says, let there be light, and there's light. Let there be the seas, let there be land, let there be the birds of the air and the animals of the land and the fish of the sea. Genesis chapter 1 tells us the story of creation, which is happy and effortless. God just says, let it happen, and it happens. Job, in his creation story, has a creation that's more violent, has a creation story that's more dangerous, that's edgier and more uncertain. So we hear about thunderbolts and torrents of rain. We hear about a creation where it's not all about people. We hear about a creation where there's all parts of creation that don't have any people, and the rain falls on those just like it falls on any other. So Job tells a story of creation that is not effortless and happy. It's scary and unpredictable, and it doesn't all revolve around people. It has a creation that has so many different kinds of characters. There are scary monsters that we don't have in Genesis 1. An image that comes from this creation story from Job is that the sea burst forth from a womb. So we have from Job a story of the world being created like a birth. And you kind of wonder, why is this creation story so different from other creation stories? And when you realize that Job has a specific angle that he's trying to develop, he has a question that he's trying to answer, that can tell you why this creation story is so different. Job is exploring the question of suffering, of why suffering happens, and what we make of suffering, and what meaning we assign to suffering, and what we do with our suffering. So for Job, that brings him to a creation story which is painful and uncertain and difficult and scary, unlike Genesis 1, which has an effortless, happy creation story, because both of these creation stories are not meant to tell us about creation. They're meant to tell us about us as creatures and the one who created us. So creation for Job involves birth, and birth is typically painful and uncertain and risky. So Job says, life is a scary, uncertain place with lots of pain and difficulty and danger. And so he has this creation story which emphasizes that our lives begin usually in a birth that is painful and difficult and uncertain and risky. And our lives often end in that way too, in some pain and some uncertainty, at least anyway, and sometimes a tragedy or an accident or something. So Job wants to emphasize this aspect of life and explore this idea of suffering and what we make of suffering and what we can expect from life. So he tells a creation story which emphasizes that, and therefore is much different from the other creation stories in John's gospel, the two creation stories in Genesis, the creation images we have in Psalms. Because this creation story serves a purpose for someone who's writing about suffering. So it's important to realize that we have a multiverse going on here in the Bible, that there's not one universe, there's not one God, there's not one evil one, but in different books we get these characters, sometimes with the same name or with the same kind of a background or the same kind of a frame or something, but they're essentially different characters. This God who's buddies with Satan is not the God of Genesis 1. He's not the God of Isaiah. He's not the God of David and Solomon. They're different gods because these are different books, which give us very different ideas. Sometimes when I explain this idea to people that there are different creation stories, they're like, well, which one is the right one? But the point is that none of them is right in their details, in their facts. None of them is meant to be taken literally. All of them is meant to have a point about our lives and us. All of the Bible is not telling us one story, because all of the Bible is speaking to each of us. So the Bible can't be one story, because it's speaking to millions of different people. The Bible is God speaking to you. The Bible is God speaking to me and each of us. And it's a message from God for each of us. And that message will be different for each of us, just as we're all different and we're in different circumstances. So there is a way in which any story is not the details of the story or the facts of the story. It's not historical. It is a message for us as we listen to it. As we ask questions about it, what are you doing, God, in this story? How does this story tell me something about you, God? How does this story tell me something about what I mean to you, God? So the stories are not going to have the same message, and they're not going to have the same details, because it's ultimately us in conversation with God. We hear these stories, we react to them, we respond to them, we ask questions about God through these stories, and we continue to explore by asking questions and challenging what we hear in these stories. So as we hear about God in the book of Job, as we read about creation in the book of Job, we're not hearing a definitive account. The God of Job is not defining God for us. It is a story about suffering. It is a story about a God who rules the universe, who created everything, and what place we understand suffering has in that universe. And each of us is going to have a story about our own suffering and our own uncertainty and the difficulties that we've had. And we want to understand where God is in all that. And we engage and we discuss and we dialogue with these stories in order to hear God speaking to us in those stories. So it's important not to use the Bible to answer scientific questions. It's important not to use the Bible to explain historical accounts of events, because it's a book of faith that's conversing with each of us, a message personalized for each of us from a God who is reaching out and speaking to us and bringing us a message. There are many people who want to stand behind the Bible to make their own agenda, their own political agenda, their own social agenda, so that they'll say that the science of creation tells us that we can deny science about evolution, or the story of Genesis will help us to deny any kind of science of biology or the science of climate science or anything else. There are people who use the Bible in that way, by taking it literally because they have an agenda that they want to further. And the Bible is not meant to be read literally. And we should not use the Bible to deny science. We should use the Bible to understand God's place in our lives, God's working in our lives, God speaking to us and reaching out to us in our lives. And that doesn't align with anyone's facts about how science should be understood or denied or changed for their own agenda.